The 2026 Solstice Festival had drawn nearly 40,000 people to the Riverside grounds that night, and Sophie Vance would spend the rest of her life wishing it had drawn 40,001. She remembered the exact texture of the crowd, the way strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder, the way the bass from the main stage rattled up through the soles of her shoes, the way the summer air had gone thick with heat and light and noise. She remembered holding her mother's hand. And she remembered, with a clarity that never dulled no matter how many years passed, the moment her mother's fingers uncurled from hers and something small, cold, and metal was pressed into her palm instead, a platinum ring, still warm from her mother's skin, but somehow, impossibly, already cold at its core. Sophie turned to ask what it meant. Her mother was gone. Not gone the way someone steps behind a food truck or gets swallowed for a second by a wave of concert-goers. Gone the way a name disappears from a guest list. Gone the way smoke disappears from a room once the door is finally opened. Eleanor Vance did not call out. She did not look back. She simply became part of the crowd's motion, and then she was nowhere at all. Most people, Sophie would later tell Detective Cole Hartman, lose their car keys in a crowd like that. She lost her mother, and all her mother left behind was a wedding ring and a silence so total it felt engineered. It would take Sophie the better part of a year to understand that it was. Richard Vance did not believe his wife was missing for the first 6 hours. He believed she was lost, which to him was a smaller, more survivable word. Eleanor had never been reckless. She kept a color-coded calendar. She texted when she'd be 5 minutes late to dinner. The idea that she had simply wandered off from their daughter in a crowd of 40,000 strangers felt, to Richard, like a temporary malfunction in an otherwise flawless machine, something that would resolve itself the moment her phone found signal again. He was still holding onto that belief when Sophie showed him the ring. "She put this in my hand," Sophie said, turning the platinum band over in her fingers under the harsh light of the festival's first aid tent. "She didn't say anything. She just gave it to me and let go." Richard's first instinct was disbelief bordering on irritation. Eleanor never took the ring off, not for showers, not for surgery prep the year she'd had her appendix removed. The idea that she had slipped it from her own finger in the middle of a crowd, in the middle of losing her daughter's hand, struck him as something almost staged. He didn't use that word yet. He wouldn't use it for another 4 days. But the feeling arrived early, uninvited, and it never fully left him again. By midnight, festival security had reviewed the perimeter cameras twice and found nothing resembling an incident. No struggle, no raised voices, no one matching Eleanor's description near the medical tents, the parking structures, or the emergency exits. It was as though the search had been conducted for a woman who had never technically entered the grounds at all, despite 40,000 ticket scans, despite Eleanor's own smart glass feed confirming she'd walked through the East Gate at 6:47 p.m., laughing at something Sophie had said about the ticket line. Detective Cole Hartman arrived a little after 1 a.m., a calm, unhurried presence in a department windbreaker who had clearly worked more of these cases than he wanted to admit. He asked Richard the questions Richard expected: last sighting, medical history, financial stress, recent arguments, and then he asked one Richard did not expect at all. "Any reason your wife would want to disappear on purpose?" Richard laughed before he could stop himself. It was, he would later admit, the wrong response. But the question felt so foreign to the woman he'd built a life with, 22 years of anniversaries, a daughter they'd raised together, a mortgage half paid off, that his mind refused to process it as a real possibility. Eleanor Vance did not have secrets. Eleanor Vance color-coded her calendar. He would spend the following week slowly, painfully, learning how wrong he had been. Sophie couldn't stop replaying the handoff. In therapy sessions she would attend months later, she'd describe it not as a memory but as a loop, the chill of the ring, the specific pressure of her mother's fingers, the way the crowd's noise seemed to swallow the moment whole the instant it happened, as if the universe itself had conspired to erase the seam between mother present and mother gone. What haunted her most wasn't the disappearance. It was the silence. Her mother hadn't screamed, hadn't been pulled away by force, hadn't left a bag, a phone, a shoe, any of the debris that usually marks an abduction or an accident. She had left exactly one object, handed it to exactly one person, and vanished with what Sophie could only describe as intention. "She didn't lose me," Sophie told Naomi Castellano 3 days later, sitting cross-legged on Naomi's kitchen floor because she couldn't stand to be in her childhood home. "She let go of me. There's a difference." Naomi, who had been Sophie's closest friend since their college dorm assignment had accidentally paired them a decade earlier, didn't try to talk her out of the feeling. She simply asked the question that would quietly define the next several months of their lives. "Then, why would your mom plan to disappear from her own daughter?" Sophie didn't have an answer, but she had the ring, and unlike her mother, the ring wasn't going anywhere. It was Richard who found the first true anomaly 4 days into the search, and it arrived not through police work but through an old habit. Alina had always used a shared cloud photo library, a small, sentimental thing she'd set up years earlier so family vacation photos synced automatically across devices. Richard opened it out of nothing but grief, hopping to look at her face, and instead found a folder he didn't recognize. It was labeled, simply, Solstice. Inside were 17 photos of the festival grounds, taken over the previous 3 weeks, wide shots, entry points, a photo of the East Gate, time-stamped at different hours of the day as if someone had been studying the crowd flow. Richard sat with his laptop open for nearly 40 minutes before he called Sophie. When she arrived, she said the thing they were both thinking and neither wanted to say aloud. "She scouted it, Dad. She picked the exit point." The word sinister did not cross either of their minds because the discovery didn't feel evil yet. It felt clinical, precise, like watching someone else's carefully drawn blueprint and only belatedly realizing your own house was built from it. Detective Hartman's involvement deepened once the department's digital forensics unit confirmed what Richard had already suspected. Alina's final biometric ping, logged by the city's ambient recognition grid, a network Sophie had always found faintly unsettling, placed her walking against the natural flow of festival foot traffic in the final 90 seconds before she vanished. Everyone else moved toward the main stage. Alina moved toward the river footbridge alone, with what one witness later described as a kind of calm you don't see in someone who's lost. That witness, a festival vendor named Teresa Kwan, remembered Alina clearly because of how unusual her demeanor had been. "She wasn't looking for anyone," Teresa told Hartman's team. "She looked like someone arriving somewhere, not someone leaving. Arriving somewhere." The phrase lodged in Sophie's mind like a splinter. It was Naomi who suggested pulling Alina's full smart glass archive rather than just the final festival footage, a suggestion that would crack the case wide open, though none of them understood that yet. Naomi worked in behavioral data analysis for a healthcare startup, and she had the technical patience Sophie lacked in those early, frantic weeks. Over the following days, sitting in Naomi's cramped apartment, the two of them combed through months of Alina's ambient recordings, footage Alina herself likely didn't know was retained in such detail. They found the pattern almost by accident. Every Tuesday afternoon, for the past 11 months, Alina's location data showed a 90-minute gap, a window where her smart glass feed simply stopped recording, always at the same downtown coffee house, always resuming afterward as if nothing had happened. "People don't have unexplained 90-minute gaps," Naomi said quietly, "unless they're hiding who they're with." Meanwhile, the ring itself had become an object of obsession for Richard in a way that worried Sophie more than she said aloud. He'd taken it to a jeweler for cleaning at first, a small, almost superstitious act, as though restoring its shine might restore some order to their lives. And the jeweler, an older man who'd handled the couple's wedding bands 22 years earlier, noticed something under magnification that no one had ever seen with the naked eye: an engraving. Tiny, deliberately hidden along the inner curve of the band where it would sit against the skin, invisible unless the ring was removed and examined under proper light. It read simply, EK, always the choice, never the accident. Richard stared at the initials for a long time before speaking. "EK," he said, "not EV, not Alina Vance." Sophie felt something shift in her chest, a cold recognition that preceded understanding by several seconds. Who's EK? Neither of them had an answer that night. But the ring, which had once symbolized 22 years of marriage, had just quietly begun to symbolize something else entirely. A life that predated or existed alongside, the one they thought they knew completely. Where are you watching from? If you're watching this from somewhere warm tonight, somewhere your own family is asleep down the hall, drop the name of your city below. It's a small thing, but it means more than you'd think to know how far a story like this one travels. And if a piece of you already suspects where this is headed, stay with Sophie a little longer. The truth was closer than any of them realized, and it had been waiting 11 months to surface. Naomi's data work led them to a name within the week, Marcus Reyes, a name tied to a private financial account Alina had opened 4 years earlier under a slight variation of her own, Alina Cade, not Alina Vance. The account had modest but steady deposits, transferred quietly from Alina's personal savings. Money Richard had never noticed missing because Alina had always managed their joint finances with meticulous, trusted precision. Sophie sat with that fact longer than any other. Her mother hadn't just kept a secret. She had built an entire secondary identity, complete with its own name, its own accounts, its own quiet architecture, and she had done it patiently over years, while sitting across the dinner table from the family who had no idea any of it existed. She wasn't hiding an affair, Naomi said carefully, watching Sophie's face. She was hiding a whole other life. Distinction mattered more than either of them expected. An affair could be an accident, a lapse, a mistake made in a weak moment. What Alina had built required years of discipline, years of a woman meeting herself in 2 separate mirrors and choosing, every single day, to keep both reflections intact. Cole Hartman found Marcus Reyes within 9 days, and what he learned reframed the entire investigation. Marcus wasn't a stranger who'd swept a bored housewife off her feet. He was, according to public records, someone Alina had known since before she'd ever met Richard, a relationship that had ended decades earlier, only to quietly resume 4 years ago, according to the financial trail Naomi had traced. Sophie insisted on being present when Hartman interviewed him, a decision Richard fought and eventually lost. Marcus was in his late 50s, composed in a way that Sophie found almost insulting given the circumstances, and he did not deny the relationship when Hartman laid out the evidence in front of him. Alina and I found each other again 4 years ago, Marcus said, his voice even, careful, rehearsed in a way that suggested he had imagined this conversation many times before it happened. What we had wasn't new. It was unfinished. Unfinished doesn't explain a fake identity, Sophie said, her voice sharper than she intended. It doesn't explain disappearing from your own daughter in a crowd of 40,000 people. Marcus was quiet for a long moment before answering. She didn't disappear from you, he said. She disappeared from a life she'd already decided wasn't hers to keep living. It was the closest anyone had come to a confession, and it landed like one. The name Alina Cade, Hartman's team eventually confirmed, wasn't an alias invented for the affair. It was Alina's name before she'd ever legally changed it, decades earlier, for reasons buried in records so old they required a court order to unseal. Richard had known his wife had a complicated relationship with a difficult childhood. He had never known she'd once shed an entire identity to escape it, only to quietly rebuild it in secret the moment an old connection resurfaced. She didn't just betray you, Naomi said gently to Sophie one night, both of them exhausted, surrounded by printouts and financial statements. She spent years building an exit before she ever used it. The ring wasn't a goodbye. It was a receipt for a decision she'd already made a long time ago. Sophie turned the ring over in her fingers, the engraving now impossible to unsee. Always the choice, never the accident. Her mother had wanted someone to eventually understand that this hadn't been an impulse. It had been a plan, refined over years, executed with the same quiet precision Alina had once used to color code a family calendar. The cruelty of it, Sophie realized, wasn't in the leaving. It was in how long her mother had let them believe there was nothing to leave. Richard did not rage the way Sophie expected him to. He grew quiet instead, the kind of quiet that worried her more than shouting would have. He stopped eating properly. He stopped sleeping in the bedroom he'd shared with Alina for 2 decades, moving instead to the guest room, as though proximity to her side of the closet had become unbearable. 22 years, he said to Sophie one night, staring at nothing. I don't know which 22 years I was actually living. Sophie didn't have an answer that could comfort him because she was asking herself the same question. Every childhood memory now felt like it required re-examination. Every family dinner, every anniversary, every ordinary Tuesday, all of it potentially shadowed by a version of her mother neither of them had ever been permitted to meet. It was Naomi, ultimately, who offered the only perspective that helped. You're not required to rewrite the good memories, she told Sophie. Your mom made a choice that hurt you both. That doesn't mean every year before it was a performance. It means she was capable of loving you and still choosing to leave. Both things can be true, even if only one of them feels fair. Vance, or Alina Cade, as she now insisted on being called, was found 11 months after the festival, living in a coastal town 3 states away, in a modest home registered under her restored legal name. Detective Hartman located her through a routine financial flag, a transaction so mundane it almost went unnoticed, a property tax payment made under a name that had, until that point, existed only in old sealed records and a hidden engraving. Sophie insisted on being the one to see her first. The reunion did not go the way television would have scripted it. Alina opened the door with an expression that held no visible guilt, no tearful collapse, no desperate apology rehearsed for exactly this moment. She looked, Sophie would later say, like a woman who had simply been waiting for the inevitable conversation to finally arrive, not with dread, but with a strange, unsettling calm. You found me, Alina said. Not a question, not surprise, an acknowledgement. You wanted to be found eventually, Sophie replied. Otherwise you wouldn't have used your real name on anything. Alina's expression didn't waver. I wanted to be found by someone who was ready to understand, not by someone still looking for the mother she remembers. It was, Sophie realized, the closest her mother would ever come to remorse, and it wasn't remorse at all. It was simply an explanation, offered without apology, as though the years of silence and the hidden accounts and the engraved ring had all been perfectly reasonable steps toward an inevitable outcome only Alina had been allowed to see coming. Sophie asked the question she'd been carrying for 11 months, the one underneath every other question. Do you regret it? Any of it? Alina considered this with a stillness that Sophie found almost admirable, in the way you might admire the calm of someone standing at the edge of something dangerous. I regret that it hurt you. She said finally, I don't regret choosing myself. I spent 22 years being someone I built for other people. Alina was mine before any of you existed. I wasn't ready to let her stay buried. There was no version of that answer that could satisfy the daughter standing in the doorway. Sophie had come 3 states away hopping for an explanation that made the pain make sense, and instead she'd received a philosophy, one her mother clearly believed in completely, and one that offered Sophie nothing except the confirmation that Alina's choice had never truly been about the family she'd left behind at all. Richard, when Sophie called him afterward, took the news with a silence that stretched long enough that Sophie checked if the call had dropped. 22 years, he finally repeated, and she doesn't regret it. It wasn't a question either. It was a man finally closing a book he'd been unable to put down for nearly a year. If you've ever wondered if any part of this story feels close to something in your own life, a parent who kept more hidden than you ever knew, a piece of yourself you've quietly buried to keep peace with the people around you, you're not alone in that, and this community exists partly because so many of you carry versions of these questions too. Let us know where you're tuning in from tonight. It helps more than you know to see how far a story like Sophie's reaches. Sophie kept the ring. It was Naomi who asked her gently, weeks after the coastal town visit, why she hadn't simply thrown it into the ocean the way some part of her had clearly wanted to during the drive home. Sophie thought about the question for a long time before answering. Because it's not just proof of what she did, she said. It's proof that I existed in the moment she chose to leave. She could have vanished without giving me anything. She didn't. Whatever that handoff meant to her, it meant something. I don't have to forgive her to keep that. Richard, for his part, never asked to see the ring again after the coastal visit. He filed for a quiet, uncontested divorce, the paperwork moving through the system with none of the drama that had defined the previous year, as though even the legal system understood there was nothing left to fight over. He did not speak to Alina again. Some doors, he told Sophie, don't need to be reopened just because you finally understand why they were closed. Alina Cade did not attempt to reach out to either of them again either, not out of guilt, Sophie suspected, but because in Alina's mind, the story had already reached its natural, deliberate ending. She had made her choice years before the festival. The festival had simply been the execution of a plan drawn up long before her daughter was old enough to understand what a ring pressed into a palm could really mean. Sophie still wears the ring sometimes, though never on her ring finger. She wears it on a chain, close enough to feel its weight but far enough from her hand that it never feels like an inheritance she has to accept fully. It is cold to the touch, still, the way it was on the night of the festival, a permanent temperature that Sophie has come to understand was never really about the metal at all. It was about a woman who had spent 22 years being someone else's version of herself, and who chose, in a single silent second inside a crowd of 40,000 strangers, to finally stop. Sophie doesn't know if she'll ever fully forgive her mother, but she knows the ring will outlast the anger, the same way it outlasted the marriage, the same way certain truths outlast the silence people use to bury them. If you're still here, still watching, still thinking about someone in your own life who left more questions than answers behind, tell us where you're watching from tonight. Some stories don't end with peace, but they end with understanding, and sometimes that has to be enough.